And welcome into another episode of Flyers Files on 97.3 ESPN. Kevin Durso and Haley Taylor Simon with you once again. And it's been a little bit, of a recent surge for the Flyers coming back from the Four Nations break. 2 wins in their first 2 games back. They've scored a combined 12 goals in those 2 games. You add that to the win that they had going into the break. They've won 3 straight games. Despite all of that, we're not getting hopped up on playoff talk, but we are looking at some small successes, things that are good for the future, for sure. Haley, I want to talk about I have 4 players in particular that I think we need to talk about from a successes standpoint of these 2 games, because the points were just piling up for a few guys as soon as they came back. We've got to start with Matvei Michkov, because he comes back from this break and looks like a completely different player. Like, the mental break was huge for him. We knew this probably was going to be the case, but to actually see it in action, I think, watching him put up 5 points in 2 games, I think that says it all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 2 games with multi-points for Michkov is huge, and head coach John Tortorella did say after last night's game that he thinks that Matvei Michkov benefited the most out of this break. I think for Michkov, he's such a competitive player and a competitive person, and I feel like being on this Philadelphia Flyers team, sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating, right? Where you do have some really good surges, and then it kind of just goes downhill, and we see this pattern quite a bit. So for Michkov to kind of reset, refocus, and play the hockey that we saw him play in the very beginning of the season was much needed for him.
Yeah, and I looked back at it because right away there's a lot of talk about where he ranks among rookies and things like that. And as I was looking at some of the rookie rankings, the more I thought about it, I'm like, this guy probably isn't a finalist for the Calder the way this is going right now. That you're behind in the points per game area behind Macklin Celebrini. Lane Hudson, I think, carries this historic market that he plays in. He's an American player in a historic Canadian market, probably the
Mhm.
most historic market in the NHL, honestly, with their success over franchise history. And then quietly, and I say quietly because it's not the first position I think you think of, but Dustin Wolf is putting together an impressive Calder campaign. And I think Michkov, with all of these factors kind of against him, falls behind that. But this is his way back into the race, is putting up a lot of points in a short period of time. I think we think about that time frame, that 5 games he had where he had 10 points, and it was like all eyes on him. Look at what he's doing. Game winners in there, multi-point games. Look at what he can do. And then it really faded. I looked it up. It was a 26 game stretch with just 7 points. He's matched the 7 points in the last 4 games he's played. So that kind of tells you how much the break was needed. I mean, he did get 2 of those before the break as well. And I think that a lot of that had to do with somebody who was on the other side of the ice for that game that he wanted to kind of impress a little bit, that wanted to play, kind of played up to that competition. But coming back, he's looked like the player we saw at the beginning of the year, that was completely fresh, obviously. And I think that goes a long way to what he could do in the future. And I think it sets the stage also for the future of his career. Like, it's not like this guy has ever lost what it is. It's just, you're going to hit that wall sometimes. Now, once he's able to put that all together and is used to this type of schedule, I think the sky's still the limit for him, obviously.
Yeah, and the rookies this season are absolutely phenomenal. So it is big competition. And I recall the beginning of the season, I want to say about the first 10, 15 games, as you said, Kevin, all eyes were on Matvei Michkov. And I feel like he was at that point the number 1 contender. But obviously, the way that the season panned out, he kind of just hid between the cracks. I don't want to say that he was ever bad, because he wasn't, but he just wasn't putting up the points that he needed to put up to be in the race. But right now, they were calling this the unofficial second half of the season, even though we're a little bit past the halfway point. Actually, quite a bit past the halfway point.
There's only 23 games left.
Yeah, so I don't get why the NHL on national media is saying that, but the way that Matvei Michkov needs to attack these next 20-something games is just put up as many points as possible, play the hockey that you came out here to Philadelphia to play, but most importantly, contention or not contention, right, for the Calder, it's about one thing only: setting up his future as a Philadelphia Flyer, as you mentioned, Kevin. And I think that Matvei Michkov is doing a very good job on setting up where he is going to be on this team, because he's going to be a franchise player. We all know that, if things pan out. So the more he just plays the way that we all expected him to play, the better it's going to be for him overall.
Well, and I think about, like, we know what kind of competitor he is, and we know that he wants to be successful. I keep going back to his answer after the win against Pittsburgh, that he wants to score goals, that he likes scoring goals more than setting guys up, but he'll do whatever it takes to help the team win. And he said something really interesting because, the Flyers gained no ground in the playoff race with that third straight win. They're still 5 points back because there's just so many teams in front of them. But the fact of the matter is that you can't tell, especially a competitive guy like Michkov, don't tell him that you're out of the race, because they don't want to hear that type of stuff. They still want to play and compete to a level that meets their expectations. He had something interesting to say about that, where it was basically, if you're not going for that, then what's the point of training,
Mhm.
basically? And I come away from that thinking, like, it's not going to amount to something this year. Okay. And that's not a big deal for him. He's got a long career ahead of him. But I love the mentality right away that, go ahead, keep talking about that. I loved it when he had the line about being cold blooded in those situations, that you want to take advantage of them when they present themselves, when, with a game winning goal or something. This is just as good. What's the point of going through all the training if you're not going to make the playoffs, or at least try to? So, he can't control that whole narrative for himself, because, or for the team, I should say, because he's one guy. But I like that attitude, and I like that mindset, because once there's more around him, that's only going to help more. I never worry about him losing, taking the eyes off the prize, per se. That's what I really like about that. Even if by this point it's probably too late for them, I still like what that means for his future, because to me, that's a guy who I think, very much in line with the rest of the organization, wants to do this sooner rather than later. Maybe it wasn't going to be this year. They've kind of always said that, the management has anyway. But does that mean the management's looking at the final year of his entry level deal and thinking by then we should be much more in contention? I think that aligns with the way that Michkov's talking, at least. And I think that's the way Michkov would want it, is to not go through another 3-4 years of, well, they're not ready yet, they're not there yet. I think he wants to be there sooner rather than later, based on his comments.
Yeah, and that's the one thing I noticed about Matvei Michkov since day one of him being here in Philadelphia, well, actually Voorhees, New Jersey, is that he just has this competitive nature about him, and he knows what he needs to do, and that's to play good hockey and to win. And he doesn't have any excuses. If he doesn't have a good game through, translation, obviously, he says along the lines of, I need to be better, or, he takes a lot of accountability. And again, I have to remind myself that he's only 20 years old, because the way that he speaks sometimes reminds me of maybe a 24, 25-year-old, with just how intuitive he is with what needs to get done with this hockey team. I think the problem is with the Philadelphia Flyers, they're just too far behind. And I know anything is possible, and I get that whole narrative. But right now, we do have the trade deadline that's nearing almost 9 days away, I want to say, Kev. And I think they're going to sell. So if they do sell, they're going to get rid of some players that have been helping them find success a lot lately. But we all kind of knew heading into this season, this was not a playoff season. We knew that this was more so of a, hey, this is the final year of missing out on the playoffs with this rebuild type of season. The Flyers are still in a really bad cap space. But I do want to say, with the recent trade of Frost and Farabee and getting Kuzmenko, I'm actually happy for Michkov. I think the more you have Russians kind of come into the organization, right, it's a good thing for Matvei. And I think at the end of the day, too, there was a goal last night. I believe it was Rasmus Ristolainen who scored, and he was assisted by Michkov with a nice feed, and then Igor Zamola got the secondary. And I kind of just laughed to myself because it's, I don't know. During that goal, Kev, like, I know all those guys are super close. And when I had a one-on-one with Igor Zamola at the beginning of the season, he said how close him and Rasmus were and how close him and Michkov were. And it's one of those things that if you continue to build that chemistry, especially culture-wise, you're going to see a lot more success on the ice. So for me personally, that goal was something where I was like, okay, I see the vision on why they have Zamola on this team
Mhm.
still.
Well, yeah, you need him to be as comfortable as possible, and part of, I had the broadcast in my ear as we were watching from the center, and they had, and I saw this later on Instagram as well, that Sean Couturier was mic'd up, and he's been playing on a line with Michkov, and they have a way of still communicating, and I think that shows leadership on the part of everybody else. I mean, obviously Couturier is the captain of the team, so that he's got to have some of that leadership for sure. But it's good to see kind of this combination of, you see the growth of Michkov's ability to speak a little bit of English in that situation. You see
Mhm.
Couturier kind of trying to simplify everything to make sure he understands it. And that's only going to help, and he'll only get better at that as it goes on. I can't wait. I kind of can't wait to see, because it was kind of a quick developing situation with him coming over here, and then kind of a whirlwind summer. You want to just play the game, but let's face it, you just showed up. You're now going to be part of this. It was kind of a giant media tour for him too, to a degree. And as much as guys were around to be part of that with him, I'm thinking of the group that went to the Phillies game, let's just say, where Michkov's clearly the headliner of the group, but a bunch of guys go with. It doesn't equate to what happens once you actually get into the trenches of actually playing the games themselves. So now that he gets a season to do that, probably hangs around in the off season, gets a little bit more experience with that, and works on those things, I think that
Yeah.
can only help. And you know, you brought up the trade deadline.
Mhm.
I don't want to, I kind of, you brought up the trade deadline. You brought up somebody whose name is going to be circulating around the trade deadline in Rasmus Ristolainen.
I
So
also brought up the name of somebody that says whoever scores the most goals in a game usually does win.
you don't get analysis like that anywhere else,
He
right?
laughed too. I have the audio because that was before the cameras were filming,
Hmm.
and I looked at him and I let out a chuckle. Eh, he's a very funny person,
It's a
despite the fact that he looks like he could also beat you up at the same time.
it's a dry sense of humor. He's definitely he knows when, like, he picks his spots when to do things like that. He's got a great personality for it. Um, like I think about, he had a good one after he scored in overtime earlier this season where he didn't really know it was his, and we told him it was his, and he goes, "Pretty goal, eh?" Like
Yeah,
now that you know it's yours, like, even though it was kind of like nobody knew who got it, it was an ugly play, but it looks pretty when it's your name next to it on the score sheet for
it
sure.
certainly does.
Um, he's among, Ristolainen's in that talk, Scott Lawton's in that conversation. I'm writing an article about kind of to give people a primer on what to expect, because one of the things I've talked about is that with both of those guys, since they aren't on expiring contracts, there's really not a reason, like, to just trade them for whatever. They're not the typical deadline rentals,
Mhm.
but they can be valuable deadline pieces because playoff teams want guys like that. So it kind of goes both ways. You're not forced to do anything, and that can actually help you get more back in return because you aren't forced to do anything like other teams may be. So it's interesting. We're going to kind of see how that plays out. When we do our next show, we're going to have way more on the deadline because we'll be right up against it at that point. We'll be
Maybe something
maybe,
will happen.
yeah, maybe something will happen. The worst part about that is that we're bringing that up, and now you're going to speak it into existence, because we're probably going to do our next one of these from the center before
Mhm.
one of the games next week. Probably the first one of the homestand. They're gonna have a 7-game homestand coming up.
Yeah,
Seven,
which is
7 games in 12
crazy.
days on home ice. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is going to be nuts.
Living at the Wells Fargo Center.
Yeah, I know. We should bring, like, portable beds or something, like little cots or something to sleep in
Oh,
between us.
well, hey, after the dunk tank, I figured out where the best places are to hide out,
I was gonna say, actually we shouldn't do that, because they're gonna the rate of changeover is going to be insane, because I think the Sixers are
crazy,
home during part of that too. So
unfortunately.
yeah, unfortunately. Um, so we'll get into more of that. Yeah, maybe something does happen. The last time they made a trade, we were all down there to begin with. So maybe that happens again.
Now, would it be okay if we maybe said 1 or 2 names that we think could be traded? We don't have to talk about it, but that way we just have it on record?
Sure. I mean, the two that we've talked about the most are probably the two most likely, but I have a feeling I know one of them that you're going to bring up at least.
I see, and I don't think this is going to happen, and I know this doesn't make sense financially by any means, but why do I sense something might happen with Jamie Drysdale?
I don't think so with him. Believe it or not, the defenseman I think that might be more on the market is Cam York. Honestly,
Yeah, I feel like he would be okay with it too.
I think Drysdale, they still want to work with him more. I think they see a lot of potential because he's still slightly younger. With York, the contract's up. If they were to go that, and I don't get the sense they want to move him either, for what it's worth.
No, but
there's some weird stuff with, I saw some things that, and like I brought this up on, I think Monday on the Sports Bash, that they're not looking to, like, at least they're not talking like they want to do this, but there's been some stuff out there that they could try to flip Kuzmenko and see what they could do with that. I wonder, the other name I kind of wonder about, and this has nothing to do with anything like long-term future by any stretch, but do you kind of do in good service? Do you look for an opportunity for Erik Johnson somewhere where he could win a cup as like a seventh or eighth? You know, I don't know that anybody's taking him, but if there's a market, do you explore it? You're listening on
No.
everybody. Let's be real. You're listening on everybody whose name is not Matvei Michkov and probably, Travis Konechny and Owen Tippett. That's about it.
The one thing I will say is that, and I had a one-on-one with Erik Johnson a couple days ago at practice,
Mm-hmm.
and whenever I talk to him, the impact that he brings to this team, to the locker room, to the younger players is so valuable. And I remember day one, I even asked Matvei Michkov this when he first got here to Philadelphia, if there was any players that he spoke to prior, and Erik Johnson was one of those names.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, yes, he won the cup with Colorado. It was awesome. Good for him. I feel like he is just so key on being this leader for this Philadelphia Flyers team, that as much as I think all the players, would want to hoist the Stanley Cup again, I feel like he is completely content just being this kind of veteran leader and giving guidance, knowing that this is most likely going to be the last season he plays. So if it was any other player, Kevin, I would say yes, but I just get the sense that he's okay with the role that he's in.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. I've gotten that sense all along, and I do think that there's an element where, because he's already won. If he hadn't won before, then I think you
Well,
do
that's
everything
different.
in
Yeah.
your power to get him somewhere where he can, for being a good sport about it after coming here at last year's trade deadline first and
Wait, I'm
foremost,
sorry.
and then
Hey,
good.
you survived the Philadelphia Flyers for over a season.
Yeah, I know,
It was time
right?
to get that cup.
Yeah.
But another name too, and again, like all these names, circulate in my head, and I think he's a great person, but maybe Hathaway. I feel like you could have him on a kind of a playoff contending team because he does bring a lot to the ice in terms of physicality.
Hmm.
Um, I think, and I know they gave Sealer money, so I don't think they would get rid of him, but you have to think, like, all these names come up in my head and I'm like, wow, you really could, like, give a reasonable explanation as to why certain players they could move. And I don't think
You could do
anybody
it
on
for
the
just about
team is
everybody,
safe.
honestly. I mean, just about everybody on the team, you could give a reasonable
Who wants
explanation
Ivan
for doing it.
Fedotov?
That I think is an off-season discussion.
I know. Hey,
You
one can
know,
only try to get a good goalie. But hey, listen, and I covered the St. Louis Blues, and I'm just going to put this out here now. A lot of rumors circulating around Jordan Binnington, and I'm the reason why I'm saying that is because the goalie market in the NHL, and this is not just the Flyers, it's probably the worst it's ever been in terms of there just not being a lot of good staple goalies. So
mhm.
there's a multitude of teams that are really looking to have this big franchise goalie, not just Philadelphia. So as great as a job as Sam Harrison has been doing, because he did step up big time,
Mhm.
um, I wouldn't count out the Flyers even trying to get a backup goalie. I just wouldn't count them out making that's like the only move I could see them kind of like buying in a sense if the offer is right and they could get good value for it.
The only reason I don't think that's gonna happen is because we were just basically over that last year. Basically, it was the same conversation. I actually just found a clip of me doing one of the shows on 97.3. I forget which one, where I brought up the only way they would do this is if it was like a fifth round pick or something. Like,
Yeah.
it's gonna have to be low price. Otherwise, I think you just ride it out. I've said for a while that I think the goaltending play is a long-term situation, that they like the two guys that are in the pipeline, especially. That's
Yep.
the long-term play. I right as of right now, I'm not doing anything with Sam Harrison because of the fact that
So,
long haul, think about it. I mean, I don't know, how many years you think you've got to wait for the next guy in line, but long haul, that might be a guy who's still backing up in the right situation.
yeah.
And I would never have a problem with that. I would never see an issue with Sam Harrison being part of a tandem. He'd be a perfect fit for something like that. Because I always stop myself short of he's elite. He's not in the elite category. He's a very capable starter
Yep.
constantly. And, the funny part is that you bring up Bennington, and I just know the people here would have a field day with, and I mean the fan base at that point. They would just have an
They
absolute
would love
field day
it.
with what they think of him. I'm
They
sure.
love it. They would love it. He's no, and the one thing I will say is, and I think talking to and Kevin can attest to this too, we talk to a lot of different NHL players, whether it's opposing teams
Hmm.
or even if it's the Philadelphia Flyers, and I feel like sometimes, and before I began covering this team, I would have like in my head, there's one player that comes to my mind actually, Travis Konechny.
Hmm.
And I always thought for whatever reason, like he had an attitude issue when I was just, before I covered them, when I was just watching based off of what I saw on the ice and sometimes just, after, post game interviews online.
Hmm.
And then being around Konechny, I was my first season, I want to say like 4 years ago. I was like, wow, he's actually a very nice, down to earth kind of person. And nothing what I thought of him through being a fan was how he actually presented himself when I was then media. So
Hmm.
I think that Binnington gets a really bad rep. I think a lot of players like Brad Marchand gets a bad rep. And I get it. Like he licked people. Like I get that he's not everyone's favorite type of guy. But Konechny was literally on the back of him going to get the trophy when Team Canada
Yeah.
won. So I feel like don't, and this is what I always like to say at the trade deadline, and this is the last thing I'll say on it,
Hmm.
is if the Flyers do, and they're not going to get Jordan Binnington, by the way, but if they do get a player, right, maybe they don't have like the best reputation. Now, if they're like a bad person, a criminal, obviously don't like them.
Right.
If you think that, oh, well, this person's like an attitude problem, they're bad in the locker room, don't judge it because chances are they're usually not. Like Ryan Suter, I covered the Blues, as I mentioned. People said, "Oh, he has such a bad attitude issue, nobody likes him." I literally spoke to him. I spoke to his teammates about him, and they
Hmm.
all really loved him. So I feel like that's the one thing I will say. Base players off of how they play on the ice. Base it off of hockey. Don't base it on anything else. That's a very John Tortorella kind of answer that came from me just
Yeah,
then.
really, it is. So, well, first of all, I can't think of. And look, when sometimes you get guys after a game, they're not in the mood to talk, and it's understandable. I've never personally had a bad interaction with Travis Konechny ever.
No,
Always
no.
had good interactions with him. I think he's a great guy. No problems there. I understand the point. See, I was more talking about with the Bennington thing that had less to do with the attitude thing and more just to do with the perception of like every game is one soft goal and everything like that. And people just eat that stuff up
Oh,
online,
I
you know,
took that
you
the
know,
other way.
despite the fact that, like, look, did he just outplay Connor Hellebuck in the championship game of Four Nations? Yes. When it came down to it, he outplayed him.
He
And that's the
won
way
a
it is.
Stanley Cup his rookie season, and he took over from Jake Allen being in it.
And he's gone through it too. Like,
Mhm.
you got to go through the adversity of it too. I kind of where I was actually going with this initially with the attitude thing was is that sometimes it's not even a thing that where it's somebody coming across in some sort of way or anything like that. It's just kind of, I guess, can be a demeanor thing to a degree because you hear all the time, like Kuzmenko's a perfect example of this, that there's an issue of some kind that it doesn't work out with a team. The guy's got a great personality, so I don't think it's an attitude problem per se. It's just maybe either losing interest or that something happens along the way where you're not utilized into your best ability or it's not meshing the way that you want it to or whatever the case may be. But I don't think that always has to translate to attitude. I think it comes across that way when we read body language, but it doesn't always mean that the person has a terrible attitude all the time. And
Right.
and I think that's something that easily gets misconstrued that way. Marchand's another one. I wouldn't, I don't, if I was a player or a coach and I had to prepare myself for going against Brad Marchand, I would hate doing it every single time too, because I don't want to go against that guy. But do I see things that happen with him off the ice that I sit there and go, like, he's a perfectly good guy otherwise, it seems like it, he doesn't seem like he's got an attitude problem away from the game. It's kind of this persona that you adopt when you get into the heart of the season, that you have to have that mindset. You're a competitor. You want to be successful. I think it gets overblown. I do think now. So I want to shift gears back to a couple more players, and then I want to get into your stories from the carnival as well. We have that
Mhm.
to touch on as well. Let's talk about the line that was all over the place against the Penguins, which I don't know what it is about that team. When they play the Penguins, these three guys seem to just step up and play better. Tyson Forster ends up having really good numbers against the Penguins. Noah Cates has really good numbers against the Penguins. Bobby Brink now can claim his career game to be against the Penguins. they were all over the place. And that's a line that has consistently been together for several months, consistently been the best line on the team. So maybe, I'm probably overblowing this a little bit when I talk about, oh, you're listening on everybody except for Michkov, probably. That's a little overblown because I don't think that they want to move on from any of these guys. I think that they see a future, maybe not as the top line, obviously, but I do think that they see a future with all three of these guys.
Yeah, I think Noah Cates had a really good game. Tortorella even jokingly said, "When was the last time Cates got a goal?" And having 2 goals in that game was really huge for Cates. Obviously, assists. I was a little disappointed in how Cates has been playing as of lately, but he said that he took this break very personally and that he's ready to be competitive. And I think that again, it just goes to show that these guys came out of this break with a newfound motivation. And I want nothing but the best for Noah Cates. I remember when his brother Jackson Cates was playing up here with him, and I've always thought Noah had really good capability. I think that sometimes he just kind of gets lost out there on the ice, but again, he's not going to be a top line kind of person, which obviously we kind of all knew about him. But again, it's fine. I mean, as long as he's putting up points and he's doing his job, I'm fine with it.
Yeah. So I don't want to take up too much time on the current team for a second and all this stuff with that. We have plenty of shows to do that. The carnival was Sunday though. So I want to hear more about this from you because you were all over the place. Sometimes, as you were telling me, sometimes longer than you expected to be in certain places.
Oh, yeah. So I'll start with the dunk tank, Kev. I was in the dunk tank for more than 30 minutes. Shift was 30 minutes.
It's everyone's favorite thing to do at the carnival, by the way, is go and dunk your favorite Flyers writer or whatever. Now, I never make it to this thing, so I never get the chance to even be part of this.
It was my second season doing this dunk tank. And last year I was very lucky. I got the morning shift. So I was the first one in. This year I was the lunch shift, which means I got the most amount of people. And I'm telling you, I always have this rule when it comes to the children because I want the kids to have a good time,
Mhm.
obviously. If you're under 12, if you miss it, you can hit the button, you can dunk me. It's for the kids. I want them to have fun.
Yeah.
The adults saw the kids doing this, and with the exception of my parents, because that's okay, like, I get it,
Sure.
the parents began to hit the button. The volunteers began to hit the button. At one point, I just was sitting in the water. It was freezing cold water, by the way. And I'm like, "God, there's no point in me getting up because I'm just gonna get back in again." I got dunked over 50 times. Yep. So it was freezing, it was cold, but the good thing is it did raise a lot of money for Flyers charities and they do so many great things for the community. And just to touch on that really fast and just to kind of plug Flyers charities because I think what they do
Mhm.
is phenomenal. They have so many different options that you can give back to the community. Obviously, with the Ed Sider Youth Foundation, you can kind of donate to that. They also have rink renovation, and hockey is expensive. We all know that. We are all hockey heads here
Mhm.
and they are actually helping local rinks with some renovations, whether that's having new ice, new boarding, even equipment, and they're really trying to help the Philadelphia community and make hockey more inclusive for everybody. They're also doing Building Hope. So essentially, Alex Sanheim, who is Travis Sanheim's wife, I got permission, by the way, just to say her name. I always like to make sure that I'm able to do that.
Mhm.
Um, her and a couple other Flyers wives are actually teaming up to redo an 8-year-old girl's house who has leukemia. And they're giving her her dream house or her dream room. And then for the parents as well, they're making sure that they are getting what they want as well. And
Mhm.
Dan Hilfery's wife is very attentive and she's been calling the family almost every day. Hey, I saw this. Do you want, so it's a very good thing that they're doing. Then you have Half's Heroes and he helps first responders. So whether you're a policeman, a fireman, you work as an EMT, dispatcher, there's so many ways that he is helping that community along with his lovely wife, Lindsay. And then finally, you have John Tortorella and the John and Christine Tortorella Foundation and Hockey and Hounds and they are helping rescue animals all over the country. I found out that Tortorella has 3 horses and 5 rescue dogs, and he is honestly, and you can put the hockey stuff aside, such a
Mhm.
good person. He said that the best part about him having his platform is that he can bring awareness to the good that needs to be done in the community. So It's a busy day. I spoke to a lot of players, sometimes a little goofy, but this year my main focus, and this was my third year covering it,
Mhm.
was just to really highlight what Flyers Charities does, because you don't have to be a Flyers fan to maybe benefit from Flyers Charities. If you're somebody that might be, they do a lot with St. Christopher's Hospital.
Mhm.
Um, so I do encourage everybody to check out the website, flyerscharities.com. And whenever you donate like the 50-50 raffles, or you go to the carnival, or you do any of the auctions, anything like that, your money, they're not profiting off of this. As I said, it's all charity.
Mhm.
SPCA, all these things. You're literally saving the lives of people, animals, or bettering the lives of children living in the Philadelphia community. So that's my little spiel.
What I like about that is that because kind of everybody has their own thing to a degree. So there's all these branches of different ways to be part of this charity effort, right? Like
Yep.
it's not like it goes to one thing or anything like that. And that's not to say that a lot of money going to one cause is not important, but everybody's got like their own dedicated passions for something. What like you brought up with Garnet Hathaway side of this, with John Tortorella's side of this. Now, I got to ask you, because we've interacted with John Tortorella plenty
Mhm.
in the past. Now you're talking to him one on one
Yep.
and talking to him about the next thing that he is most passionate about, maybe even more so than
More
hockey
so than
to a
hockey.
degree, because he does. So I just got to know, how much did he light up at having conversations about that? Because he seems like every time you can bring up anything with animals, he's just he almost becomes a completely different person.
He was. I had to remind myself a couple of times that I was talking to John Tortorella, because as soon as he walked in the room for our interview, he just was smiling. He shook my hand, and he knows, being in the room, he knows, faces and people who they are, but we just kept it
Hmm.
all about the animals. And I think the most and I was listening back to the audio, and I've never got a sense of being emotional when listening to John Tortorella talk.
Hmm.
Maybe sometimes annoyed, but
Hmm.
not ever emotional. And he was talking about dogs, and he said, I just want the dogs to be dogs. And I used to go and volunteer during the lockdown. I believe he was out in Tampa
Hmm.
and then Columbus, so he did both of it. He
Hmm.
would say during the lockdowns, I would go to the shelter and I would walk dogs for 1 hour every single day with my wife.
Yeah.
And at that moment, it hit me, because I feel like with the head coach, right? Do I agree with all the decisions he makes? Absolutely not. But I think that sometimes these people get put into categories where you just assume, oh, he hates the younger players. He has so much hate in him. But at the end of the day, he is a good guy. And anybody that likes animals is usually a good person, I would say. Um, but it was a really cool thing. I forgot to mention this, and this is the last thing I'll plug.
Hmm.
Cam York, obviously from California, a lot of devastating wildfires that
Yeah.
happened. And Cam just wanted me to just spread the message to donate to the Red Cross if possible, if you're able to do that. And if you're not able to donate, because I understand times are tough, I get it. He just said, just send good thoughts out to everybody that's kind of battling through everything like that. But definitely, yeah, as I said, John mentioned too, and this is the last thing I'll say. I can't say that's the last thing, but this is the last thing I'll say is when it comes to money, he says, I know not everybody has money to donate, but time is just as valuable and it shows that you care. So you can go to your local shelter, walk a dog, or play with a
Right.
dog. You don't have to spend any money, you don't have to donate anything. Even if it's like you're seeing somebody maybe struggle carrying their groceries, if they're an older person, and you just go up to them and help them. Just do nice acts of kindness around the community. And I'm really proud of the guys, because they definitely stepped up in the past couple years, being around this team. And I'm just most impressed with Alex Sanheim, Carly Konechny, and Lindsay Hathaway when it comes to the wives, because they have
Mhm.
stepped up tremendously when it comes to making an impact.
Yeah, that's what makes the whole thing even go. And what I like to hear kind of about this type of thing is you know, there's always new faces coming in to be part of this thing. It's been around for so long that team changes over. There's new players who come in and they get to experience something that not a lot of teams have in this respect. Definitely not with the history of this for sure. So it's always interesting to hear how people kind of embrace this in whatever way. Like like when you bring up what Garnet Hathaway does and what Garnet Hathaway and his wife do, I think about the way that Wayne Simmons, who came into
Mhm.
this with no knowledge of anything of what this was like when he was traded here, but then
Yep.
embraces it, and now he's back as part of the organization. He's still doing things around this, obviously. So like it's something that I think that lasts with you for a while. You know, you brought up with John Tortorella. It's traveled with him. The foundation and his care for animals and doing what he can with animals in the communities where he is closest to at that time. So whether it's Tampa, whether it's Columbus, whatever it may be, you know, that's always a part of it. That it goes with you, but you kind of there's always that element, and it's happened in a lot of different ways, not necessarily just with the charity, that people who are part of the organization kind of tend to find their way back to these things in some capacity. They do things with alumni now at the carnival more than I think bigger and like in a bigger way than they have in the past. Sometimes, they have sections where the alumni are around, and that's again, it's another way to keep raising money for different causes. Um, yeah. I think it's a good note to end on because sometimes we
And
have to talk about the team and it's not always the best note. Charity and what these guys do for this is always a good note to end on.
I would love to give a couple more shout outs. I have a list of just names
Yeah,
really
go right
fast.
ahead.
Let me go pull up my little note thing. It's funny, there's so many emails that I get from charities, and I have it all in a
Yeah.
Google Docs. So just give me 1 second. Okay. So in terms of the wives, I just want to mention the wives again.
Yep.
Alex Sanheim, Carly Konechny, Lindsay Hathaway, Misha Briere, Taylor Tippett as well. She's been helping people in the Philadelphia region, New Jersey region with the Learn How to Skate program, and she's been very involved with that. And then in terms of some players, Hathaway, Scott Lawton, Sean Couturier, Owen Tippett, Noah Cates, and Travis Konechny and Travis Sanheim both work together, by the way, as well. So just want to give all of them a shout out. Misha Briere, 100%, and Danny as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And see, ending this with Danny Briere is exactly my point. That it never leaves. Like how many carnivals did Danny Briere get to do as a player first and
Right.
foremost? That now you're part of it in a different way, and it stays with you. So yeah, I think it's such a great way to end this because like I said, we could constantly end on like the sour notes of
We could.
a game doesn't go
I think
well,
this is the
something
first
happens.
positive we've ended on.
Because it's always a positive to talk about something like this successful thing that takes place every year. Well, didn't for a little while because of obviously all the situations that were going on in the rest of the world when
Yep.
COVID was very active and things like that. It's great that they got back to this though, because it's just such a part of the fabric of the organization. It's such a key part of this whole thing. And I think there's a carryover effect because I know, I wasn't around. I wasn't around on Sunday specifically, but to see people again on Tuesday night when the next game was played, I think that people who were around who have any involvement in working some aspect of it, and maybe the guy who's at the top of that list is Dan Hilferty, who kind of is the man in charge of everything. Maybe it was the score of the game. Maybe it was the fact that they just raised a lot of money for charity. Whatever it was, he was in a very good mood
Yeah.
on Tuesday night. So that's always good. So that's going to do it for this episode of Flyers Files. We'll be back next week with another episode as the trade deadline approaches, and who knows what we'll have to talk about. Maybe some trades, maybe nothing at all yet, and just things brewing. We will see. We might go into more detail about what's happening around the league because I think that that's what's going to go hand in hand. The market will be dictated, the Flyers activity will be dictated by the market. So we'll see where that goes. Until next week, for Haley Taylor Simon, I'm Kevin Durso. This has been Flyers Files on 97.3 ESPN.